The train had already gone. That was the first thing people noticed when they found her. Not the girl herself, but the absence of the locomotive, the silence it left behind, and the way the snow kept falling as though the world had no interest in the emergency unfolding at its feet. Black Hollow Station wasn't much of a station. It was a platform, a roof on 4 posts, a hand-painted sign that had been weathered past readability, and a single iron bench bolted to the boards. That bench was where Rhett Mercer found her. He almost didn't stop. Rhett had been riding since before dawn, pushing his horse through a snowstorm that any sensible man would have waited out, because Rhett Mercer was not a sensible man. He was a practical one, and practically speaking, the supply run to Caldwell Creek couldn't wait another week. The roads would only get worse. The drifts were already knee-deep in the lower passes. He'd made this ride 100 times. He knew every frozen mile between Iron Hollow Ridge and Black Hollow, knew the exact creak of the platform boards underfoot, knew the bench. He didn't know the girl. She was slumped against the bench's iron armrest with her coat pulled tight around her shoulders and her boots, entirely wrong for this weather, thin leather meant for somewhere warmer, buried in 4 inches of fresh powder. Her hat was gone. Her dark hair was tangled with ice at the ends. Her lips had gone the color of a bruise. She might have been sleeping. She might have been dead. Rhett pulled his horse up, studied her for a long moment, and said out loud to no one, "Well, hell." He dismounted. His first instinct, the one he'd spent 20 years cultivating, was suspicion. Men out here didn't survive by assuming the best about strangers. You could get robbed at a station. You could get lured into a trap with a body in the snow that turned out not to be as unconscious as it looked. Rhett had heard of that happening twice, once in Meridian County and once closer to home than he liked to think about. He approached the bench carefully, his hand loose at his side, not reaching for his gun but not far from it either. "Hey," he said. Nothing. "Hey," louder this time. He crouched down and got a better look at her face. Young, not a child, a woman, maybe early 20s, but she wore the kind of exhaustion that made ages hard to read. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, little puffs of vapor that came too far apart. He pulled off one glove and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat. Pulse. Faint. Too faint. Rhett straightened up, looked left and right down the empty platform, looked at the empty road beyond it, and recognized that he was entirely alone with a dying stranger and approximately 0 good options. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Come on then." He got her up. Barely. She was lighter than she should have been, which told him something dark about the last few days of her life. And she made a sound when he lifted her, something between a moan and a word that he couldn't parse. He got her draped across his saddle, belly down like a sack, which was ungainly and undignified but kept her from sliding off. And then he led his horse by the reins back toward Iron Hollow Ridge at the fastest walk the snow would allow. She didn't wake up the whole ride back. The ranch house at Iron Hollow Ridge had been built by Rhett's father, with the philosophy that a man's home should look like it intended to outlast him, which it had, twice over now, the elder Mercer long buried in the ground behind the eastern pasture, and Rhett's wife Margaret in the ground beside him, 4 years back, and still a bruise that didn't heal right. The house was low and wide, built from stone and dark timber, with a porch that wrapped 3 sides and a fireplace in the main room large enough to stand in. It was not a warm house, in the way that some houses feel warm even before you light a fire. It was functional. It was solid. It was the kind of place that kept the cold out rather than let anything in. Rhett's ranch hand, a sun-leathered man of 50 named Doss Garrett, who had been with the Mercer family since Rhett was 12 years old, was at the front steps when Rhett came back. "That's not supplies," Doss said. "Sharp eye." Rhett handed him the reins. "Get her inside, 2nd bedroom." "Who is she?" "Don't know yet." Doss Garrett had spent nearly 4 decades working for one Mercer or another, and he'd learned somewhere along the way that when Rhett used that particular flat tone, the one that was too controlled to be casual, there was no percentage in asking more questions. He helped carry the girl inside without another word. They got her into the 2nd bedroom, the one that had been Margaret's sewing room before it was a guest room, and before that nothing in particular. And Rhett sent for the only woman on the property, a cook named Fay Solis, who lived in the small house behind the main barn with her husband, one of the field hands. Faye was broad-shouldered and practical in the way that women on the frontier had to be, and she walked in, took one look at the situation, and said, "You two, out." Rhett and Doss went out. An hour later, Faye opened the door and told Rhett that the girl was alive, that she had mild frostbite on 2 of her toes and 3 fingers on her left hand, that she was severely undernourished, and that she was currently sleeping under every blanket in the room. "She wake up at all?" Rhett asked. "For a minute. Asked where she was." "What'd you tell her?" "Iron Hollow Ridge, Rhett Mercer's place." Faye paused. "She got a look on her face when I said that." "What kind of look?" Faye thought about it. "Like she was deciding something. Then she went back under." Rhett nodded and walked away, and that should have been the end of his thinking about it for the night. But he stood at the window of the main room for a long time after supper, watching snow fall on the dark land, and found that he couldn't quite let it go. That look Faye described, like she was deciding something. People in bad situations either trusted you or they didn't. The ones who were deciding something were a third category, and in his experience, the third category always turned out to be the most complicated. She slept for nearly 2 full days. Rhett kept the house running the way it always ran. The horses needed feeding, the cattle needed checking, the fences along the north quarter had taken damage from the storm and needed someone to go look at them. Life on Iron Hollow Ridge had its own momentum that didn't stop for strangers in the second bedroom. He checked on her twice a day, nothing more. Faye brought broth morning and evening and reported back. On the third morning, the girl was sitting up. Rhett came in with the second cup of coffee he'd poured for himself, habit older than reason, and stopped in the doorway when he saw her. She had one of the blankets pulled around her shoulders and was looking at the small window on the east wall with the fixed expression of someone working through a long and difficult calculation. She heard him in the doorway and looked over. Her eyes were dark, a deep, complicated brown that had shadows in it even in the thin winter light. She looked at him the way a person looks at something that might be dangerous, assessing and careful. "Elena Voss," she said. Her voice was rough from sleep and probably from whatever she'd been through before the station. "That's my name, in case you were going to ask." "I was," Rhett said. He came in and set one of the coffees on the small table beside the bed. "Rhett Mercer, this is my land." "I know." She looked at the coffee, then at him. "Your cook told me." "You remember any of the ride back here?" "Pieces." A pause. "The saddle." "Sorry about that. You were," he searched for the right word, "not cooperative." Something shifted in her expression just for a second. Not quite humor, but in the same neighborhood. "I was unconscious. That's what I meant." She looked at the coffee again. He could see the want in it, the effort it took her not to just reach for it. There was something deeply private about that restraint, and it made him look away. "Go ahead," he said. "It's for you." She picked it up with her left hand. The right was still bandaged, the frostbitten fingers wrapped in cloth that Faye had changed that morning. She held the cup with both palms and didn't drink yet, just held it, and Rhett understood that she was warming her hands first, and that she'd learned to appreciate that kind of warmth through its absence. He sat down in the chair by the door, the one that had no particular reason to be there except that someone had left it there once, and it had never moved. "Where were you going?" he asked. "Before Black Hollow." Elena was quiet for a moment. "South," she said. "South is a direction. It's not a destination." "It was what I had." Rhett studied her. She was young. He could see that more clearly now that she was upright and conscious. Early 20s at most. And she was thin in a way that had happened fast, the kind of thinness that comes from not eating rather than not having enough, because her frame said she wasn't built slight. There were shadows under her eyes that weren't just from the sleep debt. Whatever she'd been running from, she'd been running hard. "You have family somewhere?" he asked. A stillness came over her face that was worse than flinching. "No," she said, "not anymore." He didn't push. He'd learned from Margaret, from years of frontier life, from watching men and women in the particular extremity that this kind of country produced, that there were things people would tell you when they were ready, and things they'd carry to the grave, and no amount of asking changed which category something fell into. "You can stay until you're on your feet," he said, standing up. "After that, we'll figure out the rest." He was at the door when she said, "Thank you." It was the kind of thank you that came out stripped of all ceremony, nothing polite about it, just the raw fact of it. He almost said, "You're welcome," the way anyone would, but something stopped him. He just nodded and left. She was on her feet in 5 days. Not steady feet. She had to hold the wall in the hallway the first time, and Faye caught her arm on the porch steps. But she was upright and moving, and that counted for something. By the end of the first week, she'd started helping in the kitchen without being asked. Faye watched this development with a complicated expression and reported it to Rhett in the way that people report things they haven't decided how to feel about yet. "She just started washing the breakfast dishes," Faye said. "Didn't say a word, just started." "Let her," Rhett said. "She's a guest." "She's somebody trying not to feel useless." He looked up from the ledger he'd been working on. "Let her." The second week, Elena Voss appeared in the barn doorway at 6 in the morning while Rhett was feeding the horses, wearing a borrowed coat 2 sizes too big and boots that Doss had found in a storage chest, worn but warmer than what she'd had. "I want to work," she said. Rhett kept filling the feed bucket. "Work. I'm eating your food, sleeping in your house. I want to earn it." He set the bucket down and turned to look at her. She was standing straight, chin up, the coat hanging off her shoulders in a way that would have looked ridiculous on someone who was trying to look ridiculous, but she wasn't. She was absolutely serious, and there was something in her eyes that he recognized, the specific pride of someone who's been brought low by circumstance and is in the process of deciding it won't happen twice. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes." "Well," a flicker of something. "Well enough." He picked up the feed bucket. "We'll find out." She could ride. Rhett gave her the oldest, most patient horse in his stable for the first outing, a bay gelding named Creed who had been everywhere and seen everything and did not believe in excitement, and watched her from the fence line. She was a little stiff, favoring the left side slightly, but her seat was good, and her hands were quiet on the reins, and she didn't fight the horse when he picked his own line through the snow. By the end of the hour, she had Creed moving in circles and changes of direction without any visible conversation between them. Doss, standing beside Rhett at the fence, said nothing for a while. Then, "She's been on horses since she was small." "Looks like," Rhett said. "Ranch girl." "Yeah." Doss pulled his hat down against the wind. "Got a ranch somewhere?" Rhett watched her bring Creed back to the fence at a walk, sitting easy in the saddle, her dark eyes scanning the horizon the way a person scans a place they're not sure is safe. "Had," he said. Elena pulled up in front of them and swung down without difficulty. She ran a hand along Creed's neck. "Good horse," she said. "He's got opinions," Doss offered. "So do I." She handed the reins to Doss without ceremony. "Tomorrow I want a harder one." Doss looked at Rhett. Rhett looked at Doss. Neither of them said anything. Elena walked back toward the house. "Huh," said Doss. She told him about her family on a Tuesday evening in the third week, without warning or preamble, in the way that certain truths have to come out. Not because you decide to tell them, but because they've been pushing at the inside of you long enough that the pressure finally wins. Rhett was at the table in the main room, working through a stack of correspondence that had backed up during the storm. Elena had come in from the barn, having spent 2 hours with the horses in the cold because she seemed to need the space, and she stood by the fireplace to warm up. He didn't pay her much attention. They'd developed a kind of domestic rhythm that required very little maintenance. They occupied the same spaces without crowding each other, spoke when there was something to say, and had learned to read the particular quality of each other's silences. "My father's name was Cole Voss," she said. Rhett looked up. Elena was facing the fire. She still had her coat on, half unbuttoned, and she was looking at the flames with that calculating expression he'd come to recognize, the one that meant she was deciding how much truth, how much detail, how much of herself to put in the room. "He ran the Voss family ranch, just east of Millhaven Creek," she continued. "Been in the family 3 generations. Good land, good cattle. Not large. We weren't wealthy, but it was ours." She paused. "There are men called the Graves Syndicate. You've heard of them?" The name hit him like a cold hand. He set his pen down. "I've heard of them." Everyone in the territory had heard of the Graves Syndicate. Most people said the name quietly, and some didn't say it at all. They were a land operation. That was the polite word for what they did, land operation. And the territory had seen their kind before. But the syndicate was organized in a way that most weren't. They had lawyers and money and the specific kind of ambition that didn't stop at the edges of the law because it had already bought the edges of the law. They wanted land. They always wanted more land. And the methods they used to get it ranged from paper manipulation to things that happened in the dark and got buried there. They wanted our land, Elena said. Sent men to talk to my father about selling. He said no. They sent more men. A long pause. He said no again. Rhett waited. Then one night in September, 4 men came to the ranch house. Her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when a person has told themselves they will not break. They set fire to the barn first, to drive everyone out of the house. My father went out to see... She stopped. Elena. He never came back inside. She turned from the fire. Her eyes were dry, which somehow made it worse. They shot him in the yard. His 2 hands, Pablo Reyes and a boy named Jem, who had only been with us 6 months. They ran, and I don't know what happened to them. I hid in the root cellar under the kitchen floor. The fire didn't reach it. I stayed there for 2 days before I came out. The room was very quiet. Everything above was gone, she said. The house, the barn, the cattle were scattered, and there was a notice nailed to the post that was left from the front gate. A notice from a land acquisition company. Very official. Very legal looking. Saying the land had been transferred to a holding entity associated with the Graves Syndicate for non-payment of a debt my father had never contracted. They fabricated a debt, Rhett said. They fabricated a debt, she said, after they murdered him. Rhett was quiet for a moment. He picked up his pen and then set it down again. You went to the law. I went to the town marshal in Mill Haven. He told me these were civil property matters, and he had no jurisdiction. She said it with absolutely no inflection, which was its own kind of fury. I went to the county seat. The sheriff there said the same thing, different words. The judge who might have helped was in Caldwell, and by the time I got to Caldwell, I was told the case had already been reviewed and closed. They've bought half the territory, Rhett said quietly. Not a question. More. She buttoned the top button of her coat, as if making a decision. I ran out of money in Harrow. I sold my horse to get the train ticket. I don't know why I bought it to Black Hollow specifically. I don't know what I thought I was going to do when I got there. She looked at him directly. And then your horse found me on a bench in the snow. My horse, Rhett said. You were following him. It was the first thing approaching a joke she'd said since she arrived, and it was so dry he almost missed it. He looked at her for a moment. What was your father's brand? He asked. She told him, the Voss cattle mark, a V with a second line through the bottom, that she'd watched her father press into iron and into hide since she was small enough to sit on a fence post. She described it with the kind of precision that only came from having seen a thing so many times it lived in the muscle memory of your eyes. Rhett nodded slowly. I've seen that brand on cattle that came through the auction in Caldwell 2 months ago, he said. Sold to a buyer from the east. The paperwork said they came from a liquidated estate. The color went out of Elena's face. They took everything, Rhett said, and then they sold it. Yes, she said, and then, I am going to get it back. He looked at her. She was 5'4" in borrowed boots, 12 pounds underweight, with frostbitten fingers on one hand and a story that would get most people's sympathy and nothing else. And she had said, I am going to get it back the way a person states the temperature outside. Not a wish, not a threat, not a prayer. A plain fact about the future. He picked up his pen. All right, he said. All right? All right. He went back to his correspondence. We'll talk about what that looks like. What it looked like in those early weeks was work. Elena's thirst for capability was one of the most determined things Rhett had ever watched up close, and that was saying something, because he'd spent a lifetime watching capable people. She worked with Doss in the mornings, fences, feeding, the endless small maintenance that a ranch demanded. And she worked with the horses in the afternoons, and what had started as hesitant competence became something harder and more certain by the week. She was not a natural rider in the sense of someone born to it. She was the better kind, which was someone who had worked at it long enough that it looked natural, who had fallen off enough times and gotten back up enough times that the confidence wasn't brittle. Shooting was different. She came to it with zero pretense. I know how to fire a rifle, she told Rhett when he asked. My father taught me, but I'm not accurate. I'm not trained. She said this without embarrassment, which he appreciated. Overconfidence was how people got killed. They started with targets, tin cans on fence posts, 50 yards, then 100. And she was right. She was not accurate. Not at first. She flinched on the shot, which was the most common error and also the most stubborn, because it was the body's honest response to an explosion 6 inches from your ear, and overriding it was a matter of repetition and will. She had plenty of will. The repetition took 3 weeks. Stop, Rhett said, standing behind her, watching her line up on a can at 80 yards. She lowered the rifle. What? You're doing it again. I know. You're anticipating the recoil before you pull. I know, she said, with a sharpness that surprised him, and then seemed to surprise her. She let out a breath through her teeth. Sorry. Don't apologize, just hold. I am holding. You're holding and thinking about what comes after holding. Stop thinking about what comes after. There's nothing after. There's just the target. She was quiet for a moment. Then she raised the rifle, lined up, held, and squeezed the trigger. The can flew off the post. Neither of them said anything for a second. Again, said Rhett. She reloaded and shot the second can. The third. By the time she'd worked through a dozen targets, the flinch was almost gone. Not beaten. It never got fully beaten, but tamed, controlled, pushed down below the threshold that would ruin the shot. She lowered the rifle when she'd run through the ammunition he'd laid out and turned to look at him, not expecting anything, just asking. Better, he said. Elena nodded, reloaded, and went back to work. The distance between them, the careful mutual distance that two people keep when they don't quite know what they are to each other, developed its own texture over those weeks. Rhett was not an easy man to know. He understood this about himself without excessive regret. He'd had Margaret for 16 years, which was enough time to learn that he was better in action than in words, that his silences were more reliable than his attempts at comfort, and that the people who had managed to put up with him had done so by understanding this. He missed her in ways that were so specific they couldn't be articulated. The precise sound of her laugh at things that weren't quite funny, the way she always fell asleep before he did, the arguments they'd had about the same 2 or 3 things for a decade and a half without resolution. He didn't miss the idea of her. He missed her, the specific and irreplaceable person, and the grief that came from that kind of loss didn't fade the way people said it would. It just changed shape. Elena, for her part, was not someone who asked for more than she'd been offered. She occupied the space she'd been given with a kind of precision that he recognized. The precision of someone who had learned that taking up too much room had consequences. She did not talk about herself more than she had to. She helped without being asked and declined to make anything about the help. She watched things carefully before she engaged with them. She was funny sometimes, in the flat, understated way that he found easier to take than the kind that announced itself. One morning he came into the kitchen and found her at the stove, attempting something with a skillet that was giving her trouble. She was standing very still, staring at the pan with the expression of someone who has just realized they've made an error and are calculating how bad it is. "What is that?" Rhett asked. "It was going to be eggs," she said. "I may have over-communicated my intentions." He looked in the pan. She had, in fact, over-communicated. He took the pan off the heat. "I can cook," she said, with absolutely no credibility. "At home I could cook." "I believe you." "You don't believe me." "I believe you," he said, and she finally looked at him and saw that he wasn't mocking her, and something eased in her shoulders. He set the pan in the wash basin. "Faye will be in at 7. "I know when Faye comes in," Elena said, with a dignity that was both entirely genuine and slightly undermined by the state of the eggs. "I was trying to—" She stopped. "I don't like needing things done for me." "I know," he said. He poured himself coffee. "Most independent people don't." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that what I am? Independent?" I was going to say stubborn, but yes. It surprised her into something that was almost a real laugh. Not quite, still held back, but almost. He filed it away without examining it too closely. Spring made its first tentative appearance in mid-March. A few degrees of warmth that the wind hadn't earned yet, mud on the road where the frost broke, the reluctant return of color to the ridgeline. The ranch came alive with the kind of work that winter had been delaying: calves born in the night, fences to ride, machinery to service after months of cold had done its damage to metal and rubber and wood. Elena rode fence line now without anyone alongside her. She knew the north quarter, the east boundary, the creek crossing near the old Hanford property line. She'd learned to read the land the way you learn to read a language, not all at once, but word by word until the sentences started making sense. She was also practicing her shooting every single morning, without fail, in the early light before the workday started. Rhett noticed this and said nothing. What he noticed more than the shooting, in the way you notice things you're not looking for, was that she'd started looking at the horizon differently. Not with the unfocused anxiety of someone who didn't know what was coming, with the measured, specific attention of someone who did know and was calculating for it. One evening, she came to the table where he was working and set a piece of paper in front of him. On it, she had drawn, from memory, a map. It wasn't a rough map. It was precise. Distances indicated, landmarks noted, property lines drawn from memory with the kind of detail that only came from having grown up walking the land. The Voss family ranch, the neighboring properties, the roads that connected them, the locations of Graves Syndicate holdings marked in a different hand, heavier pressure. I've been tracking the syndicate's land movements through the newspapers that come through Caldwell, she said. They've acquired 6 additional properties in the last 8 months, 3 by purchase, 2 through that same debt scheme, 1 through a boundary dispute that somehow ended in their favor before the court case was 6 weeks old. Rhett studied the map. It was a very clear picture of a cancer spreading through a body. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking it doesn't stop," she said. "Not on its own. Not through courts. Not through marshals who've been bought." She put her finger on Iron Hollow Ridge on her map. "They'll come here eventually, not because of me, because you're in the way of what they want." He looked at her. "So I'm not just asking this for myself," she said. She held his eyes with hers, and she was absolutely steady. "They're coming either way. I'd rather meet them knowing something about who they are and how they work." Rhett looked back at the map for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you know about where the syndicate keeps its records?" Elena sat down across from him. "Tell me what you know about a man named Craddock," she said. Rhett's jaw tightened. She had done her homework. "How do you know that name?" "Because he's the one who handed my father's land over to the syndicate," she said. "He's their man in the county seat. He's got a county official seal and the integrity of a hired rat." Rhett was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, and he thought about Margaret, who had looked at him once, 15 years back, when they were talking about some trouble or other. He couldn't even remember what now, and said, "Rhett, the people who are afraid of everything end up losing everything anyway. You might as well stand for something while you've still got your feet." "All right," he said. He reached out and turned her map so he could see it better. "Show me everything." She leaned in over the paper, and they talked until past midnight, and the fire burned down to coals. And outside, Iron Hollow Ridge lay still in the early spring dark, unaware of what was beginning. The first serious trouble arrived in April on the back of a Graves man named Foster Kane. He'd been asking around at the feed store in Caldwell, so Rhett heard about it through the feed store's owner, a reliable man named Whitby, who owed Rhett several years' worth of fair dealing, asking whether Rhett Mercer had any unusual visitors at the ridge this winter. The description he gave the feed store owner was accurate enough to have come from someone who knew what they were looking for. They knew Elena was alive. Rhett told her at supper. He watched her face when he said it, and she didn't flinch, which was either courage or the particular kind of numbness that comes from having been afraid long enough that the fear has burned itself to something harder. "How did they find out?" Doss asked. He was at the table too, which was a statement of how serious this was. Doss ate with the family only when things were being decided. "Could be anything," Rhett said. "Someone at the station saw her, someone at a town between Millhaven and here, someone who knew the family and heard she'd survived." He paused. "Doesn't matter how. What matters is they know." Elena was quiet for a moment, then she said, "They'll send someone to confirm." "Already done," Rhett said. "Kane was the confirmation. He's gone back now." He set down his fork. "What comes next will be more direct." Elena looked at her plate, then back at him. "I should go. she said. Flat, not asking permission, just stating a fact she was examining. I shouldn't bring this to your door. Little late for that, Doss said. Doss, Rhett said. I'm not being callous, Doss said. I'm being accurate. They know she's here. Moving her doesn't unring that bell. Rhett looked at Elena. She was doing that thing with her eyes, looking at some middle distance where she was working something through, and he'd learned to wait for it. After a moment, she came back. Then we don't run, she said. No, Rhett said. We prepare. Yes. She picked up her fork. Tell me about the North Quarter, she said. The terrain there, the sight lines, Elena. She looked at him. Eat your supper first, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer, and something moved through her expression. Relief, maybe, or the specific and strange comfort of someone who has been carrying something alone for so long that having another person put their hands on it feels like the ground coming up to meet your feet. Then she looked back at her plate. Yes, she said, and ate. 3 weeks later, one of the Graves men made it onto Iron Hollow land. He came through the east fence on a gray horse with no markings, which was not subtle but wasn't meant to be. They weren't sending scouts anymore. They were sending messages. He was big, broad-shouldered, with a gun on each hip and the particular confidence of a man who'd never had anyone push back effectively. Elena was the one who found him. She'd been riding fence line in the late afternoon, and she came around a copse of cedar, and there he was, sitting his horse at the middle of the Mercer land like he owned it, looking at the ridge and the house and the barns with professional assessment. He looked at her when she came out of the cedars, and he smiled. Well, he said, Elena Voss. She had the rifle across her saddle. Not pointed, not yet. You're on private land, she said. So I am. He didn't move. Mr. Graves wanted me to give you a message. I'm not interested in Mr. Graves's messages. That's all right. You'll hear it anyway. He reached into his coat, and she raised the rifle, and he stopped. He showed her an empty hand. Easy. It's just a paper. Put it on the ground, she said, and ride back the way you came. He looked at the rifle. He was a professional, and professionals made assessments. He studied her for a moment, the steadiness of the barrel, the set of her shoulders, the fact that she was not scared, or if she was scared, it was not reaching her hands. And something in his calculation shifted. He dropped the paper in the snow. He touched his hat, still smiling. Be seeing you, he said. Not on this land, she said. He turned his horse and rode back toward the east fence. Elena waited until he was over the fence line, then swung down and picked up the paper. It was a letter. A legal letter from a land acquisition firm, very official, very well produced, informing Rhett Mercer that the Graves Syndicate was prepared to offer a generous price for Iron Hollow Ridge, and that he was invited to discuss terms at his earliest convenience. She brought it back to the house and put it on Rhett's table without a word. He read it. She watched his face. He had a way of going very still when he was angry, the opposite of most men, who showed it in motion, and he went very still now. Then he folded the letter carefully and set it on the edge of the table. Well, he said. Yes, she said. The word hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than it should have, full of the thing that had been building since March, since the map on the table, since the first morning she'd picked up his rifle and pointed it at a tin can and missed, the weight of what was coming. How's your shooting? He asked. Better than it was, she said. Good, said Rhett Mercer, and he reached for his pen. Part 2. A survivor forged into steel. The letter from the Graves Syndicate sat on the edge of Rhett's table for 2 days before he burned it. Not in the fireplace. He took it outside to the small iron barrel they used for burning trash and dropped it in with the rest of the week's paper waste, and Elena watched from the porch without saying anything. The gesture wasn't dramatic. That was why it landed the way it did. He wasn't making a statement. He was simply disposing of something that didn't deserve to be kept. That night, he wrote 3 letters of his own, one to a lawyer in Caldwell he'd used once on a grazing dispute, one to a man named Harlan Pruitt, who had been a land surveyor and was now something harder to define, and one to a territorial newspaper editor named Bess Whitmore, who had a reputation for printing things that powerful people preferred stay unprinted. He sealed all 3 and gave them to Doss to take to the mail post in the morning. Elena watched him address the envelopes. "You've been thinking about this longer than I have," she said. "I've been watching the syndicate work for 2 years," he said. He blotted the last envelope. "I just didn't have a reason to move yet." She sat down across from him. "And now you do." He didn't answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer. He set the envelopes in a stack and squared the edges against the table. "The law isn't going to help us," he said. "You already knew that. Courts are slow, and the syndicate has lawyers who get paid to make them slower. So we work around the law. Not against it, around it. We build a record. We get the right people asking the right questions in the right places. We make it cost them more to push us than it's worth. And if they decide it's worth it anyway, then we deal with that when it comes." He looked at her. "But they're businessmen. Businessmen weigh costs." Elena was quiet for a moment. "The man who burned my father's ranch wasn't doing a cost analysis," she said. "No," Rhett said. "He was following orders from someone who was." He paused. "Those are the people we need to worry about." She nodded slowly. It wasn't agreement exactly, more like the acknowledgement of a fact she'd have preferred to be different. Then she said, "What do you want me doing while you work the legal side?" "Same thing you've been doing. Learn everything about this land, every fence line, every road, every approach, and keep shooting." "I've been shooting every morning." "Then keep doing it." She pushed back from the table. Then she stopped. "Rhett." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. "Not for shelter. For—" She seemed to find the word insufficient and gave up on it. "For this." He looked at her for a moment. "Cole Voss deserved better than what happened to him," he said. "So did you." He picked up his pen. "That's reason enough." She left him to his work, and the house settled into its particular nighttime quiet, and outside the spring wind moved across Iron Hollow Ridge and told nothing to no one. The weeks that followed were the fullest Elena had known since September. She rose before light every morning, worked the horses in the early cold while the ridge was still gray and the shadows hadn't pulled back from the fence lines yet, ate breakfast with Doss and Faye, and sometimes Rhett when he wasn't already at the table with papers spread out around him like a man building something complicated in 2 dimensions. Then fence line in the morning, shooting practice midday, and in the evenings she had taken to sitting with Rhett's territory maps and the copies he'd obtained from Harlan Pruitt's contacts, survey records, property transfer documents, the kind of dry official paperwork that contained, if you knew how to read it, a very clear story about money moving in one direction. She got good at reading it. "This transfer here," she said one evening, pointing at a column of figures on a property record for a ranch called the Aldercroft Place. "The debt listed is for a promissory note from a bank in Harrow, but the bank in Harrow closed in 1883. Rhett leaned over. He looked at the date on the promissory note and then at the closure date she'd found in a banking directory. 4 years closed, he said. "So the note is fabricated. They used the bank's name because they knew nobody would easily verify whether it was still operating." She sat back. "Same pattern as my father, different bank." Rhett straightened up and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he went to his desk and wrote a note to the Caldwell lawyer. It was becoming a rhythm between them. She found the thread. He pulled it through the right channels. They did not discuss what this collaboration had become, because there was no good language for it, and neither of them was particularly interested in finding words when the work was present and clear. What Elena hadn't told him, what she hadn't told anyone, was that she had also been doing something else with her evenings. On a separate piece of paper, in a handwriting she kept deliberately different from her usual, she had been assembling a list, not of legal documents, of names. Every man who had been reported near the Voss Ranch in the weeks before and after the fire. Every Graves enforcer whose name appeared in rumors, in the margins of dealings that Rhett's contacts described. The man who had ridden through the gate first that September night, whose description she had from a neighboring farmer who'd seen the group ride past his property at dusk. She had 4 names. She suspected she would eventually have more. She kept the list folded in the inside pocket of her coat, close to her body, the way you keep something you're not ready to share. Spring became early summer and the land softened and the cattle moved back into the upper pastures and Iron Hollow Ridge took on the particular quality that it had in the warm months. Larger, somehow, the views longer, the sense of space opening out in every direction like a room where someone had taken the ceiling off. Elena had been on this land for 6 months now. She knew the ridge the way she'd known her father's land. Not perfectly, not the way someone who'd spent decades on it knew it, but with the specific intimacy of someone who'd ridden every line of it in every weather. Doss had stopped treating her like a guest somewhere around April. It happened gradually, the way most real changes happened. Not a decision, but a drift. One day he handed her a set of the fence keys without being asked, and the next week he started including her in conversations about the cattle schedule that he'd previously had with Rhett alone. He was not an effusive man. He showed regard through delegation and through the particular quality of his criticism, which was that it was specific and useful rather than general. "You're holding your reins too tight on the turns," he told her one morning. "The horse knows what he's doing." "I know he does," she said. "Then let him know you know." She thought about that for the rest of the ride, and she adjusted. He didn't comment on the adjustment, which was how she knew it was right. What Doss did not discuss with her, and what she had begun to notice as a pointed omission, was the topic of what happened if the syndicate came in force. He was not a man who talked around things. His usual mode was blunt directness, so the silence was deliberate. She thought she understood it. There was a particular kind of man who would help you prepare for a fight and not mention the fight itself, because mentioning it made it real in a way that was different from simply readying for it. And maybe he wasn't ready for it to be real. She respected that without saying so. In June, two things happened within the same week. The first was that Bess Whitmore, the newspaper editor in Caldwell, published a piece in her territorial gazette about property transfers in the Southern Land Corridor. She didn't name the Graves Syndicate directly. It was that kind of careful, legally protected journalism that pointed at everything without touching it. But she named several of the holding companies they operated through, and she named the debt scheme. And she quoted two ranchers who had gone through the process and survived to describe it. The piece was picked up in the larger regional paper out of Meridian. Rhett read both versions and said nothing for a long time, and then he said, "First brick, one brick doesn't build anything," Elena said. "No," he agreed, "but you have to start somewhere." The second thing was that one of the Graves men came back to Iron Hollow. This was not the broad-shouldered one who'd sat in the east pasture with the letter. This was different. A lean man, not particularly noticeable in any direction. The kind of person who could walk into a room and back out again and leave no clear impression behind. Elena spotted him because she happened to be on high ground, checking a fence on the ridge crest. And she saw him below on the road that ran along the south boundary. Not on Mercer land, not technically, but on the road, watching the property with the patient attention of someone counting things. She noted the time and went back to the fence check because panicking would not tell her anything useful. When she got back, she told Rhett what she'd seen. He was quiet for a moment. "Counting hands," he said. "Getting a sense of how many people are here." "How many people are here?" He thought about it. "Me, you, Doss, Faye and her husband. 3 field hands." He paused. "Not many." "No," she said. "I've been thinking about that." He stood up and moved to the window. It was an unconscious habit she'd noticed. When he was working through something difficult, he needed a frame around the outside world, like seeing the land helped him think about it. There are 3 other ranches in the valley that haven't sold to the syndicate yet. Cullen Brothers' place, the Moreau widow, Old Man Packard, though Packard has been talking about selling anyway. He turned back. The Cullens have 5 men. Clara Moreau has her 2 sons and 2 hands. "You want to talk to them?" "I've been talking to them, informally." He sat back down. "The question is whether they'll put skin in the game." "Why wouldn't they?" "Because it's easier to hope the problem doesn't reach you than to invite it closer by fighting back." He said it without bitterness, just the flat accuracy of long experience. Most people will wait until they have no other option. Elena thought about her father, about the fact that he'd said no to the syndicate twice and probably believed each time that they would accept it, that they would move on, that the problem would make itself smaller. "I waited," she said, "in the root cellar, 2 days. "I know. It didn't get smaller." "No," Rhett said. "It doesn't." She looked at him. "I'll talk to Clara Moreau," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "What makes you think she'll listen to you and not me?" "Because I'm a woman who lost her family's land and I can tell her what it looks like from the inside," Elena said. "You can tell her it's coming. I can tell her what arrives." Rhett was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. Clara Moreau was 53 years old, a French woman by birth who had come to the territory with her husband 25 years back and stayed when he died, which was the kind of decision that told you most of what you needed to know about her. She received Elena on the porch of the Moreau ranch with a pot of coffee and the expression of a woman who had lived long enough to know when she was being told something important. Elena told her everything. Not the way she'd told Rhett, not over weeks and in pieces, and with careful calibration of what to reveal, but all of it, straight through, sitting in a chair on Clara Moreau's porch with the summer afternoon spreading out below them and the grass moving in a light wind. Her father, the fire, the root cellar, the 2 days, the forged debt, the marshal who wouldn't listen, the judge whose case was closed before she arrived. All of it. Clara listened without interrupting. When Elena finished, Clara drank her coffee. She looked out at her land, the pastures, the barn, the fence lines that her 2 sons had ridden since they were children. Then she looked at Elena. My husband built this by hand, she said. Her English was precise and careful, the French underneath it more ornament than accent. He built it from nothing. When he died, I told my boys, this is what your father made and you will not let it go. She paused. The Graves men came to me in March. I sent them away. They'll come back, Elena said. Yes. Clara set down her cup. What do you need from me? Elena told her. She told the Cullen brothers the same story 3 days later, sitting across a table from 2 men who were nothing alike except in their stubbornness, which was so identical you could have used a ruler on it. They asked harder questions than Clara. They wanted numbers, probabilities, specifics about what the syndicate was likely to do, and on what timeline. And Elena answered what she could and didn't pretend when she couldn't. By the end of the conversation, she'd earned something that wasn't quite commitment, but was closer to it than she'd had when she walked in. She came back to Iron Hollow in the evening with the particular tiredness of someone who has spent all day doing something that matters and has done it well. Doss was on the porch when she rode in. Moreau and the Cullens? He asked. Moreau is in, she said, swinging down. Cullens are thinking. The Cullens think slow, but they decide right, Doss said. He took her horse's reins. Rhett's inside. He's got news. She went in. Rhett was at the table, which was normal, but he was not working, which was not. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table, looking at nothing in particular, which was the expression she'd come to recognize as the aftermath of having received information and not yet decided what to do with it. Harlan Pruitt came by, he said. She sat down. And Pruitt has a contact in the county seat, a clerk in the land office who doesn't like what he's been watching and isn't willing to do anything about it himself, but he was willing to tell Pruitt something. Rhett paused. The syndicate has filed a preliminary claim on Iron Hollow Ridge. Not a transfer, not yet, but a preliminary claim. They're alleging a boundary dispute with a neighboring property that's already under their ownership. She understood immediately. The Aldercroft place. East boundary. Yes. They manufactured an overlap. That's what the preliminary claim will argue. His jaw was tight. The court date for the preliminary hearing is in 8 weeks. If we don't contest effectively, the preliminary becomes a lien, and the lien becomes leverage. 8 weeks, she said. 8 weeks. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, she could hear Doss talking to her horse, the low, even sounds of a man at ease with animals. And she thought about her father talking to the horses on the Voss Ranch in exactly that same register. The specific and private language of people who worked with animals long enough to know it wasn't really language at all. All right, she said. She pulled herself back to the present, to the table, to Rhett's face and the problem in front of them. Who's the judge on the preliminary? That's the thing, Rhett said. It's a circuit judge named Aldous Fenn. He rotates through every 14 weeks. He met her eyes. Pruitt says Fenn isn't syndicate. It took a moment for that to land. When it did, something loosened in her chest that she hadn't known was clenched. An honest judge, she said. A cautious one, which isn't the same thing, but it's more than we've had. He tapped the table. We have 8 weeks to build a case that a cautious man can look at and decide to act on. What do we need? The forged promissory note documentation. The closed bank records I sent to Caldwell last week. The survey discrepancy in the east boundary? Pruitt is already pulling the original survey. He says it doesn't match what the syndicate filed. And ideally, testimony. He paused. Someone with direct knowledge of the syndicate's methods, who's willing to stand in front of a judge and say so. Elena thought about the two ranchers Bess Whitmore had quoted in her newspaper piece. She thought about Clara Moreau, sitting on her porch with her coffee. She thought about the list in her inside pocket. "I can get you testimony," she said. "Elena?" "I can get it." She held his eyes. "The people who've been hit by this are still alive. Some of them. They didn't go to the law because the law was useless, not because they have nothing to say." She leaned forward. "Give me 3 weeks." He studied her face for a moment. Then he said, 3 weeks. She had 2.5. What she did in those weeks was methodical and not glamorous. She rode to 4 ranches, 2 of them half a day's travel, and she sat at 4 different tables and had 4 versions of the same conversation, and 3 of them ended with a piece of paper signed and witnessed that documented what the holder had seen and experienced and was prepared to state under oath. The 4th ended with a man who was afraid for his family and couldn't be persuaded, and she understood that and thanked him anyway, and rode back with the empty ride sitting in her chest like something she needed to work through. She got 4 pieces of testimony from 3 signatories in the Whitmore articles. It wasn't a fortress, but it was a wall. She also, during those 2.5 weeks, had an encounter that changed the temperature of everything. She was 3 miles from the Cullen brothers' ranch, on a road through scrub timber, when she became aware that she was being followed. Not in the vague way you sometimes felt followed in open country, specifically deliberately followed. She caught the sound of another horse 100 yards back, the same pace, stopping when she stopped. She did not increase her speed. She chose the next bend in the road, passed around it, and dismounted quickly, tying her horse to a tree branch and moving into the scrub on foot to put herself to the side of the road with a clear view of who came around that bend. What came around the bend was the lean man, the one she'd spotted from the ridge crest, counting workers in the south pasture. He came around the bend and found her horse on the road with no rider, and she watched him pull up and study the situation with professional attention. He was looking for her. He hadn't found her yet. She was 15 feet to his left, in the trees, with the rifle across her forearm. "That's close enough," she said. He moved his head, but not his hand. He found her in the tree line with his eyes, which was quicker than she'd expected, and his assessment happened fast, and then he went still. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was flat and careful. "You've been watching Iron Hollow," she said. "Why?" "I'm just traveling. On a road that goes nowhere except the Mercer property and the Cullen Ranch." She kept the rifle easy, not aimed, but not far from it. "Who sent you?" He didn't answer. "I know who sent you," she said. "I'm asking so I understand whether you make decisions or carry them." Something shifted in his expression, just slightly. Irritation, maybe, at the accuracy of the distinction. "I carry messages," he said. "Then here's mine. Tell whoever sent you that we know about the preliminary claim. Tell them we know about the Aldercroft boundary fabrication. Tell them we have the original survey documentation, and we have witnesses, and we have a court date in 8 weeks with a judge who was not purchased." She paused. "Tell them that if they want to negotiate, they can send a lawyer to Caldwell and talk to ours. Tell them if they send anyone else onto this land, I will stop asking questions first." The lean man looked at her for a long moment. He was calculating. She could see it. Not bravado, not fear, just the clean arithmetic of someone who understood situations and what they contained. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her face. "All right," he said. He turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. She stood in the tree line for a while after he was gone, until the sound of his horse disappeared into the distance and the road was empty, and the birds in the scrub timber went back to their own concerns. Her hands were not entirely steady, which she would not have admitted to anyone, and the steadying took its own time. She rode back to Iron Hollow and told Red about it at dinner. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You told him we have a judge." "Yes." "You told him we have testimony." "Yes." He turned his cup in his hands. "If they have anyone in the Caldwell courthouse—" "They probably do," she said. "They were going to find out eventually. I wanted them to find out from me." She met his eyes. I wanted them to know we're not hiding. Rhett was quiet for another moment. Doss at the end of the table said nothing, but he was watching Elena with an expression that was new. Not the guarded interest of the early weeks, not the measuring look of someone assessing a newcomer. Something closer to respect. That was a risk, Rhett said finally. Yes, Elena said. It was. A calculated one. I try. He looked at her for a moment longer, then looked back at his plate. Doss, he said, in the morning, I want you and 2 of the field hands to start cutting the trenches along the north approach I marked last week. Elena looked up. She knew what the north approach trenches meant. They'd discussed it, she and Rhett, in the theoretical register of people planning for a contingency. They hadn't moved to actual digging. You think they'll come, she said. I think when a man with good arithmetic tells his boss that the people they're trying to push have a judge and witnesses and no intention of running, Rhett said, his boss has to decide whether to back off or escalate. He looked at her. What would you do if you were Graves? She thought about it honestly. Escalate, she said, because backing down tells every other property you haven't taken yet that it's possible to resist. Yes, Rhett said. So we dig. The summer evening came down around Iron Hollow Ridge like a thing settling in for the long term, and the ranch went on with its particular life. The horses in the paddock, the cattle in the upper pastures, the kitchen light warm in the window. And underneath all of it, a preparation that had no ceremony, just 2 people and a handful of allies moving steadily toward something that was coming, whether they moved toward it or not. Elena went out to the porch after dinner and stood in the dark for a while. The ridge was visible against the sky. The same ridge she'd ridden 100 times now. The one that had been foreign and cold and enormous when Rhett brought her here frozen and half gone, and was now something she would have been hard-pressed to name exactly, but knew with a certainty that had nothing to do with any paper or legal claim. She put her hand in her inside pocket and felt the folded paper there, the list of names. She left it where it was and went inside to sleep. The trenches took 4 days to cut. It was hard work even in summer. The ground along the north approach was threaded with rock just below the topsoil, and the picks rang against stone half the time they swung. Rhett worked alongside the hands without making a point of it, which was the only way he knew how to lead. Not from behind a desk while other men bled their hands on iron tools, but in the ground beside them, shirts soaked through by mid-morning, back aching by afternoon. Elena worked the second shift each day, taking over from one of the field hands when his hours were done, because she had insisted on being part of it, and Rhett had learned that insisting back was a waste of energy that could be used on the trench. Doss drove fence posts along the high ground above the north approach and strung wire between them in overlapping lines, not to stop anything. Wire didn't stop men on horseback, but to slow them, to funnel them into predictable lines, to reduce the chaos that was the enemy's friend. Elena watched the wire go up and thought about the root cellar under the kitchen floor of a house that no longer existed. And the way 2 days in the dark changes a person's understanding of what preparation is for. The court date arrived before the violence did, which was the only mercy in a season that wasn't offering many. Rhett and Elena rode to Caldwell together on a Tuesday morning in late July, leaving Doss in charge of the ranch with instructions that were thorough and calm and communicated none of the weight pressing on the back of Elena's sternum the whole ride down. The Caldwell lawyer, a precise, dry-humored man named Henry Castle, who wore the same suit every time Elena saw him and had a mind like a steel trap, met them at the courthouse steps with a folder of documents under one arm and the expression of a man who had done what he could and was not making promises about how it would go. Judge Fenn reviewed the preliminary filing yesterday, Castle told them, climbing the steps. He's asked the syndicate's lawyers for the original boundary survey documentation. They'll have produced something, Rhett said. They have. It's a survey dated 1879 signed by a surveyor named Clement Briggs. Castle paused at the courthouse door. Clement Briggs died in 1876. Elena felt Rhett go still beside her. They signed a dead man's name to a survey conducted 3 years after he died, she said. They did, Castle said. He allowed himself a very small, tight smile. Harlan Pruitt's original survey is dated 1878, signed and witnessed by 2 men who are still alive and have already provided affidavits. Judge Fenn is a careful man, not a brave one, but he is not going to let a dead man's signature stand up in his courtroom. The hearing lasted less than 2 hours. Elena sat in the gallery behind Castle and Rhett and watched Judge Aldous Fenn, a thin man of 60 with a gray beard and the precise posture of someone who had spent decades deciding to take up as little space as possible, work through the documentation with the methodical focus of a man diffusing something. The syndicate's lawyers were good. They were well-dressed and well-prepared, and they argued their fabricated boundary with the kind of confidence that came from knowing they'd gotten away with it before. But the dead surveyor's signature sat in the room like a smell no amount of good argument could cover. And when Castle laid Pruitt's survey alongside theirs, and the discrepancy was visible to anyone with eyes in arithmetic, the syndicate's lead lawyer, a tall man with a silver watch chain who had clearly never expected to be here, went through a visible sequence of recalculations. Judge Fenn dismissed the preliminary claim. He also, in the kind of aside that wasn't technically part of the ruling but was very much part of the record, noted that the documentation presented by the syndicate contained irregularities that he was forwarding to the Territorial Attorney General's office for review. That last part was not something they had expected. Castle, walking out, was as close to exhilarated as Elena had seen him. "The Attorney General review is a long shot," he said, keeping his voice down. "But it creates a file. It creates a paper trail with a territorial office that the syndicate cannot buy as easily as a county marshal." "How long before they respond?" Rhett asked. "The review? Could be months, could be a year." "And in the meantime?" Castle looked at him. "In the meantime, you won today. Don't let anyone tell you that's nothing." They rode back to Iron Hollow in the long summer afternoon light. Elena was quiet most of the way, which Rhett had come to know was not discomfort, but processing. She worked things through in silence the way some people worked them through in words, and interrupting it wasn't useful. He kept pace beside her and let the miles go by. About halfway home, she said, "They're not going to accept this." "No," he said. "The legal avenue cost them something. The Attorney General file, the visibility. They'll want to make an example." "Probably." She looked at the road ahead. "How long do you think we have?" Rhett considered it honestly. 2 weeks, maybe 3. They'll need to regroup, decide on the approach, send the right people. Then we use the time. "We already are," he said. And then, after a moment, "Elena, you understand what happens if they come in force?" "Yes," she said. "I want to make sure," he said. Not challenging her, not softening it, just direct, the way he was about everything that mattered. "People can get killed. Our people. Doss, Faye, the Hands." She turned to look at him. "I know," she said. "I've known that since the root cellar." A pause. "I'm not asking anyone to die for my father's land. This stopped being just your father's land a while back." She held his eyes for a moment. Something moved through her expression that she didn't try to hide, and he didn't look away from it. "No," she said quietly. "I suppose it did." They rode the rest of the way without speaking, and the silence between them had a different quality than the silences they'd built over months. Less distance in it, less careful management of space. More like the silence between people who have said enough. The first bounty notice appeared in Caldwell 9 days later. Whitby, the feed store owner, sent word by a boy on a fast horse. A printed notice had been posted at the saloon at the mail station and at the front of the general store, offering money for information leading to the arrest of Elena Voss on charges of fraud and misrepresentation in a territorial land dispute. The amount was substantial. The charges were fabricated, naturally, assembled from the same paperwork machine that had built the dead surveyor's survey and her father's fictional debt. A second notice, this one offering a reward for her physical return, not her arrest, which was a different and darker thing, appeared 2 days after that. The wording was careful enough to have a legal reading and clear enough to anyone who spoke the language of the frontier to mean something else entirely. Rhett read both notices in the kitchen, sitting very still in the way he went still when he was angry. "They're drawing in outside help," Elena said. She was across the table from him, and her voice was steady, which she had learned was a choice rather than a condition. "Bounty hunters, mercenaries, people who don't have a stake in the territory and won't lose sleep over the details." "Yes." "That changes the numbers." "Yes." He set the notices down. "I've sent word to the Cullens and Moreau. Clara's elder son is bringing 2 extra hands. Men he vouches for, not hired guns, but ranch workers who can handle themselves. The Cullen brothers are coming themselves. He paused. That brings us to roughly 14. She did the arithmetic on what the syndicate could put in the field. It didn't resolve in their favor. It didn't resolve in their favor at all. 14 is not enough, she said. 14 with prepared ground, defensible positions, and the right terrain is different from 14 in the open, Rhett said. He wasn't wrong, and she wasn't going to argue the point, but she could see in the set of his jaw that he knew the margin they were working with. That night, she took the list out of her coat pocket for the first time since spring. She unfolded it at her small table in the second bedroom, her room. She'd thought of it as her room for months now, which was something she tried not to examine too closely, and read through the names by lamplight. 4 names. She had identified 4 of the men who came to the Voss Ranch in September. 2 of them were Graves enforcers, whose movements had been tracked by Rhett's network of contacts. One was a man named Burl Cantor, who had a reputation for the specific kind of work the syndicate needed done, and who appeared in the margins of 3 different accounts of property seizures that had turned violent. The 4th name was the one that sat differently from the others. Doyle Graves. Not the patriarch. The patriarch was an old man in an eastern city whose hands had been clean for 20 years in the technical sense, the way powerful men kept their hands clean. Doyle was the son, the operational one, the man who actually made the decisions that got made in the dark and got buried there. She had learned his name through Pruitt's contacts, through the newspaper's coverage read between its careful lines, and through a source she'd developed herself. A woman in Harrow who had worked as a clerk for one of the Graves holding companies long enough to understand what she was seeing before she found reasons to be somewhere else. He was the one who had given the order for the Voss Ranch. She was nearly certain of this. She folded the list and put it back in her pocket and sat with that certainty for a long time, in the way you sit with something you've known was coming and are now receiving, like weather that the sky has been promising for days. The Cullen brothers arrived on a Friday with 2 horses each, and a wagon of supplies they said were contributions but were clearly also a statement. Men who bring a full wagon are not planning to leave quickly. Clara Moreau's son, a quiet young man named Gilles, who had his mother's eyes and his father's economy of movement, came the following day with the 2 extra hands. They set up in the barn and the bunkhouse, and Iron Hollow Ridge absorbed the additional people the way it had absorbed other hard things, without ceremony, by simply continuing to function. Rhett introduced Elena to the Cullen brothers, large weathered men named Frank and Dale, who communicated primarily through eyebrow movements and monosyllables, and she watched them adjust to her presence with the particular recalibration that some men underwent when a woman turned out to be more competent than expected. It was not a dramatic adjustment, but it was real. Frank Cullen watched her shoot one morning in the first week. Not deliberately. He happened to be near the south fence when she was working targets at 120 yards. She was shooting with the rifle Rhett had given her in April, a Winchester that had been cleaned and adjusted until it was as close to an extension of her hands as a metal object could be. She ran through 8 targets at varying distances, pulling and resetting her footing between each one, and by the end, Frank Cullen was leaning on the fence post with his arms crossed, and his eyebrows in a position that communicated, for Frank, something approaching impressed. "Not bad," he said, when she walked back toward the house. "Not bad enough," she said. "No," he agreed, without condescension. "Not yet. You're dropping your left shoulder on the longer shots." He paused. "Bring it up about an inch." She stopped. "Show me." He showed her. It took 15 minutes, and it cost her a bruised shoulder from adjusting the position of the stock, but at the end of it, her accuracy at 130 yards had improved by a margin that mattered. She thanked him, and he shrugged, and they did not have any further conversation about it, which was the Cullen dialect for mutual respect. The evening before the syndicate came, Rhett and Elena sat on the porch after everyone else had gone in. It was not planned. They had not looked at each other and decided to sit together in the particular dark that precedes a violence you know is coming. It had simply happened the way things between them had a habit of happening, through proximity and the accumulated gravity of months, and neither of them made a point of it. The ridge was dark above the house, the stars dense and indifferent the way they always were, and the cattle were quiet in the upper pastures, and everything held the specific stillness of a country that does not know or care about the human drama unfolding on its surface. "I need to tell you something," Elena said. Rhett waited. I know who gave the order for my father's ranch. She did not look at him. She looked at the dark ridge. Doyle Graves, the son. He runs the operational side. The actual decisions, the men, the timing. I've been certain of it for 2 months. Rhett was quiet for a moment. You didn't tell me. No. Why? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because telling you would have made it a shared plan, she said, and I didn't know yet what I intended to do about it. He absorbed this. He was not, she knew, a man who flinched from hard truths, but she also knew there was a difference between understanding something intellectually and having it said plainly at night on a porch with the ground dug up below the north approach and armed men sleeping in your barn. Elena, he said, just her name. The specific weight he put on it was a question and a statement at once. I want justice, she said. Not, she stopped. I've spent 9 months thinking about what happened to my father and what I would do if I ever had the ability to do anything. And I've realized that what I want is not the same as what I wanted in the root cellar. She turned to look at him. In the root cellar, I wanted everyone responsible to suffer, specifically and at length. She said it without flinching, because it was true. What I want now is for this to stop. For it to stop meaning anything, for the Graves Syndicate to be broken and finished and buried so deep in legal consequence that they can never do this to another family. But if Doyle Graves is in that group tomorrow, then I want him to face what he's done, she said, in whatever form that takes. Rhett looked at the dark ridge for a while. The form it takes might not be a courtroom, he said, not suggesting anything, just laying out the shape of reality. I know, she said. I've made my peace with that. He nodded, slow and once. Then he said, when Margaret died, and stopped. He never talked about Margaret, not the death, not the loss, not what came after. Elena was very still. When Margaret died, he said again, I spent a year being angry at things that had no place to receive it. The land, the weather, the people who came around with food and sad faces, like they could give me something that would substitute. He paused. The anger doesn't go away. I want to tell you it does. It changes shape. Like grief, she said. Like grief. He looked at her. You've been carrying this well. I want you to know I see that. Elena looked at him for a moment, and what was in her face was not a simple thing. It was the complicated, honest acknowledgement of someone who has been seen by another person and does not quite know what to do with it. I've had a good example, she said. They sat in the quiet for another hour before going in, and neither of them said anything more, and it was enough. They came at dawn. The first sign was the horses, the barn animals who heard things before any human did, a low, restless movement in the stalls, the particular sound of animals in a contained space who want to be somewhere else. Doss was already awake when it started, because Doss had been sleeping light for 2 weeks, and he had Elena's shoulder shaken and Rhett's door knocked before the first rider appeared on the north approach. There were 19 of them. Elena counted from the ridge crest where she'd taken a position before first light, in the cold and the dark, because she had identified the ridge as the strongest observation point a month ago and had been preparing herself for this specific morning since then. 19 riders coming down the north approach in a loose formation that fanned out at the first line of wire and slowed, the wire doing exactly what Doss had intended it to do. She heard Rhett's voice from below, the controlled carrying voice of a man who has decided not to shout. Hold until they cross the second wire. She had the rifle. She had 40 rounds. She was not going to use 40 rounds at 19 men. You didn't shoot 19 men and walk away from it even on the right side of the law. But 40 rounds meant choices, and choices were what she needed this morning. The riders pushed through the first wire with wire cutters. They were not subtle. They were not trying to be. This was the message the syndicate sent when it had decided to stop sending letters. Frank Cullen was in the east fence with his brother and Gilles Moreau. Doss had the 2 field hands at the south barn wall. Rhett was at the front of the house with 2 of the other hands, and Elena was on the ridge, and this was the arrangement they had worked out over 3 weeks of preparation. And she told herself now what she had told herself then, that the ground was theirs, that they knew it better than anyone coming down that north approach, and that this mattered more than numbers. It mattered. But numbers still mattered too. The second wire line slowed them again, and in that hesitation, Rhett called out, "You are on private land. Turn around now, and there is no fight today." The answer came from a man at the front of the group on a black horse, a big man who carried himself with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being the person in the room whose opinion ended conversations. He did not turn around. He pulled his horse up at the wire and said loudly enough to carry, "Mercer, send the girl out and we'll talk terms." Rhett said nothing for a moment, then, "There are no terms." The big man on the black horse looked up toward the ridge. He was looking for Elena. He had been told, clearly, to look for her on high ground. He found her approximately. His eyes went to the right section of ridge, and he held his gaze there for a moment, and she held her rifle steady and did not fire, because she needed him to make the next move. He made it. She heard the shot before she consciously processed that he'd drawn, because that was how gunfire worked at dawn. When your body was already clenched with anticipation, the sound arrived before the thought. He shot at the ridge. He was off, by the length of a man, which was the difference between a warning and a beginning. She found his center mass in her sights and then moved deliberately to his horse and shot the horse instead, because the horse hadn't done anything to deserve today, and because a fallen horse and a thrown rider in the front of a formation was better strategy than a dead man who might inspire the 15 behind him. The horse went down. The big man came off it and hit the ground hard enough that she could see from the ridge he wasn't getting up fast. Then it broke open. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not a clean thing, and she knew it wouldn't be, and she had prepared for that. Prepared for the specific ugliness of men shooting at each other across ground that she and Doss and the Cullen brothers had spent weeks making as disadvantageous as possible for the people coming down it. The wire did its work. The trenches did their work. 2 of the riders' horses went into the shallow trench on the east approach and pitched their riders, and one of those riders came up shooting blindly, and Frank Cullen put him down with a precision that Elena saw and would not forget. One of the Mercer field hands took a shot through the upper arm and went down behind the barn wall, cursing steadily, and Faye, who had refused to leave the property and whom Elena had placed in the root cellar under the kitchen with a shotgun she knew how to use, Faye stayed where she was and did not need to use it. The syndicate men had numbers. They did not have terrain or preparation or the specific desperation of people defending something they had built and chosen and would not let go. By the time the smoke had settled into the morning air and the remaining riders had pulled back through the cut wire and gathered their wounded on the far side of the north boundary, 5 of the 19 were down. None of the Mercer people were dead, which was a margin so thin that when Elena climbed down from the ridge and her boots hit flat ground, her legs were not entirely steady, and she did not pretend they were. She found Rhett at the front of the house. He had a cut on his face from wire or debris, something that had passed close, and he was looking at the north approach with the expression of a man accounting for things. He turned when she came up beside him. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She was close enough to see the cut clearly. "That needs cleaning." "I know." He looked back at the north approach. "They'll regroup." "Yes, but they took losses." He turned back to her, and they didn't get what they came for. She looked at the cut on his face and thought about the night on the porch, and the 9 months behind them, and the list in her coat pocket, and everything that had led to this specific morning on this specific ground. Then she looked out past the wire at the retreating riders, at the last of them disappearing over the rise, and she thought about the big man on the black horse who had called her the girl, like she was a thing to be handed over, like her name was a negotiating chip, like her father's death was a line item in a transaction. "The man on the black horse," she said, "the one who gave the order to fire." Rhett was quiet a moment. "Doyle Graves," he said. She looked at him. "He came himself," Rhett said. "I recognized him from Pruitt's description." Elena looked back at the empty rise where they had disappeared. "He'll come back," she said. "Yes," Rhett said. "Good," said Elena Voss, and meant it in a way that surprised even herself. Not with fury, not with the dark heat she'd carried in the root cellar, but with the cold, clear purpose of someone who has decided that the thing ends here, on this ground, and that she is the one who will end it. The wounded field hand's name was Tomas Reyes, no relation to Pablo Reyes, who had worked the Voss ranch before the fire, though Elena noticed the coincidence of names and held it privately. He was 24 years old, and the shot had gone through the muscle of his upper arm without touching bone, which Faye declared a mercy while she cleaned and packed it with the specific efficiency of a woman who had dealt with worse. Tomas bore it without much noise, which earned him something from the room, and by the following morning he was sitting up and eating, which earned him more. Elena sat with him for a while that first afternoon, not because she knew him particularly well. They had exchanged perhaps 30 sentences over 7 months, but because she had been the one who placed him at the barn wall, and she understood that decisions have weight, and that weight belongs to whoever made the decision. "You knew this might happen," she said. Not a question. Tomas looked at his bandaged arm. "Yeah," he said. "Knew it might. I'm sorry you took that." He was quiet for a moment, the way young men are quiet when someone older than them acknowledges something directly. "Mr. Mercer said we didn't have to stay," he said. "Before it started. Said anyone who wanted to go to Caldwell for a week had good reason." He shrugged with his good shoulder. "I stayed." "Why?" He looked at her. He had young eyes, the kind that hadn't finished deciding what they thought about the world yet. "Because this is where I work," he said simply, "and because it seemed like the right side." She nodded and left him to sleep, and she carried that sentence for the rest of the day. The right side. Turning it over in the way you turn over something simple that turns out to contain more than it appears to. Rhett spent the 2 days after the siege writing. Not letters this time, documentation. A detailed account of the attack. Who came, how many, the first shot, the orders given, the wire the syndicate's men had cut on Mercer land, the names of the 5 men who hadn't ridden back out. He wrote it in the careful, factual register of a man who understood that what gets written immediately after an event, before memory has time to soften and arrange itself, is the most credible version. He had Doss and Frank Cullen sign witness statements. He had Elena sign one. He had Gilles Moreau sign one in his quiet, neat hand. He sent the full package to 3 places simultaneously: Castle in Caldwell, Bess Whitmore at the Gazette, and the Territorial Attorney General's office that Judge Fenn had already opened a file with. "This alone doesn't finish it," he told Elena when he'd sealed the last envelope. "No," she said, "but it makes finishing it harder to undo." He looked at her. Over the past weeks, there had been a quality to their conversations that was different from the careful, managed exchanges of winter and early spring. A directness that came from having been in danger together, from having sat on a porch the night before a fight and said true things. The management was still there in places, old habits being stubborn, but the space between them had compressed into something that no longer required maintenance. It simply existed. "Harlan Pruitt sent word this morning," Rhett said. "He has confirmation that Doyle Graves is still in the territory. He didn't go back east after the attack." He paused. "He's at the Aldercroft property, the one they took 2 years ago." The Aldercroft place was 11 miles from Iron Hollow Ridge. Elena absorbed this. Doyle Graves, 11 miles away, nursing whatever the attack on Iron Hollow had cost him. In pride and credibility, and the specific currency of men who ran operations like the Syndicate, the impression of inevitability, the sense that what they wanted they would get sooner or later, and that resistance was a postponement rather than a real answer. She had cost him that, at least in part. She knew enough about men like him to know that this was not something he would absorb and revise his approach around. It was something he would pay back. "He's going to come again," she said. "Yes, but this time with a different approach." Rhett folded his hands on the table. "The direct assault failed. Next time he sends fewer men, different tactics. Maybe he tries to burn us out instead of ride us down. Maybe he hits the Moreau Ranch or the Cullen place first, to isolate us." He paused. "He's patient when he has to be. That's what makes him dangerous." Elena looked at the table for a moment. She was thinking about something she'd been turning over since the dawn of the attack, since standing on the ridge and watching 19 men come through the wire, since the moment she'd recognized Doyle Graves on the black horse and understood that the man who gave the order for her father's death had come himself to finish it. She was thinking about the difference between waiting for what came next and going to meet it. "What if we don't let him choose the next move?" she said. Rhett looked at her carefully. "He's at the Aldercroft place," she said. 11 miles. Pruitt knows the property. He surveyed it before the Syndicate took it. The county seat where Craddock operates is 9 miles in the other direction." She met his eyes. The Attorney General's office opened a file, but they haven't moved on it yet. They're waiting for more. What kind of more? The kind that comes from inside, she said. Craddock has records. He's the man who processed every fraudulent transfer, who signed off on every fabricated debt. He has the documentation because these people always keep documentation. It's how they maintain control over each other. She paused. If we had Craddock's records, the Attorney General's office would have enough to act. Rhett was quiet for a long moment. You're talking about going to the county seat, he said. I'm talking about going to Craddock directly, she said. Not to threaten him, not to take anything by force. She leaned forward slightly. Craddock has been watching the Graves Syndicate operate for years. He knows the Attorney General has a file now. He knows the Gazette ran 2 stories. He knows the court dismissed the preliminary claim with a notation. She looked at Rhett steadily. Men like Craddock don't have loyalties, they have calculations. And his calculation is shifting. You want to give him a reason to shift it further. I want to give him a ladder down from a building that's starting to burn, she said. His choice whether to use it. Rhett studied her face. She had thought this through. He could see the structure of it in the way she'd laid it out, the sequence, the logic, the pressure points. She had been thinking about this since before the attack, probably working it in the evenings when he thought she was reading the survey documents. If this works, he said slowly, it could unravel the syndicate's legal structure completely. The fabricated debts, the forged transfers, all of it. Yes. And if Craddock refuses, then we come back here and wait for Doyle Graves to make his next move, she said. We're no worse off. He was quiet for one more moment. Then he pushed back from the table and stood up. I'll tell Doss we're riding to the county seat tomorrow, he said. You're coming? She hadn't assumed. He looked at her as though the question were slightly absurd. Yes, he said. I'm coming. Doss received this information with the expression of a man who had resigned himself to not being surprised anymore. The 2 of you, he said. The 2 of us, Rhett confirmed, into the county seat, to talk to the man who's been signing the syndicate's paperwork for 2 years. That's the plan. Doss pulled his hat off and scratched the back of his head and put his hat back on. All right, he said. Frank Cullen and I will hold the ridge, he paused. Try not to get shot in town. It's more paperwork. They rode out before dawn, taking a back road that came into the county seat from the north rather than the main approach from the valley floor, which was Rhett's instinct for the same reason you didn't walk into an unfamiliar room through the front door if you had another option. The county seat, a town called Harrow's Fork, larger than Caldwell, with the particular smell of a place where money and official business had been nesting together long enough to stop distinguishing between themselves, received them in the early morning quiet of a Tuesday, before the offices were open and before the streets had filled enough to notice 2 people who didn't particularly want to be noticed. Castle had provided them with Craddock's home address, not the office, the home. Because a man is different at his office than at his house, and what they needed from Craddock was not the official version of him. The house was modest, which surprised Elena slightly. She'd imagined someone who processed the paperwork of an operation like the Graves Syndicate would have been paid well enough to live larger. The house was 2 stories, well kept, with a small garden that someone had put real attention into. The kind of garden that said a person lived here who wanted to believe they were a certain kind of person. She knocked. The man who opened the door was 50, slope-shouldered, with the eyes of someone who had spent a long time looking at things he couldn't entirely look away from. He saw Elena first, then Rhett behind her, and she watched his face move through several expressions in rapid sequence before it settled on a controlled, careful blankness. Mr. Craddock, she said. My name is Elena Voss. I think you know who I am. He did. She could see it in the way his grip on the door tightened. You should leave, he said. His voice was low. If anyone sees, then let's go inside, she said. So no one sees. He looked at Rhett. Rhett looked back at him with the specific calm of a man who has dug trenches and spent a dawn on the right side of a rifle and is not currently impressed by much. Craddock stepped back from the door. The inside of the house had the quality of a place where someone had tried to make things normal and had not entirely succeeded. Too neat, the neatness of someone who controlled their environment because they couldn't control other things. Framed photographs on the wall of people she assumed were family. a coffee cup on the parlor table that suggested he'd been awake for a while before they knocked. He did not offer them coffee or seats. He stood in the middle of his parlor and looked at her like a man looking at a thing he'd spent 2 years trying to pretend didn't exist. "I know why you're here," he said, "and I can't help you." "You haven't heard what we're asking," Elena said. "I know what you're asking." He moved to the window and looked out without touching the curtain. Old habit, she thought, the habit of someone who checked whether they were being watched. "You want the transfer records. You want the promissory documentation. You want the internal correspondence." "Yes," she said. "If I give you that, I'm finished," he said. "They'll know immediately." "They'll know eventually anyway," Rhett said. It was the first thing he'd said since they came inside. He said it without heat, just the flat delivery of a fact. "The Attorney General has a file. The Gazette has run 2 stories. The Aldercroft boundary claim was dismissed by a judge who forwarded his concerns up the chain." He paused. "The syndicate is not going to survive this intact. The question is whether you go down with it." Craddock turned from the window. Something had changed in his face. Not a decision yet, but the landscape before a decision, the moment when a person can see all the roads and hasn't chosen one. "They'll say I was part of it," he said. "You were part of it," Elena said. She said it without cruelty, just directly, because he knew it, and she knew it, and pretending otherwise would not help either of them. "You processed documents that transferred my father's land after men murdered him for refusing to sell it. You signed off on a debt he never owed. You've been doing versions of that for 2 years. She held his eyes. "I'm not here to absolve you of that. I'm here to tell you that there's a difference between being part of something and being willing to keep being part of it." Craddock looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it, not the ethics of it. She didn't think he was working through the ethics. Men like Craddock had made their ethical choices a long time ago, and what remained was arithmetic. The arithmetic of what the syndicate could do to him versus what the Attorney General's office could do to him. The arithmetic of which side was going to win this and what that meant for a man who had been on the wrong one. "There's a woman in this territory," he said slowly. "Federal land investigator. She came through Harrow's Fork 3 months ago, and she wasn't here about anything official, and she left a card." He moved to the desk in the corner, opened a drawer, and set a card on the table. "I kept it." Elena looked at the card. A name and an office address in the territorial capital. "If I talk to her," Craddock said, "and if I provide documentation, the full set, not a selection, everything, I need a formal agreement from the Attorney General's office that my cooperation is acknowledged." "I can get that," Rhett said. Craddock looked at him. "You're sure?" "I know the right people," Rhett said, "and right now they want what you have more than they want you." A long silence. Somewhere in the house, a clock was ticking, the kind of domestic sound that becomes very loud when a room is very quiet. "The records are not here," Craddock said. "I moved them 6 weeks ago, when the Gazette ran the first piece." He sat down heavily in the chair behind the desk, as if something had left him. "I moved them because I knew this was coming. I didn't know in which direction, but I knew it was coming." "Where are they?" Elena asked. He told them. They were in a locked box at the office of a notary in Caldwell. A woman named Ada Birch, who had no connection to the syndicate and no knowledge of what she was holding, only that a county official had paid her storage fee for a year and asked her to hold the box for him. Craddock gave them a letter for Ada Birch and the combination to the lock. When they left his house 40 minutes after they arrived, Elena had the letter in her coat pocket alongside the list that had been there since winter. She walked beside Rhett down the quiet street toward where they'd tied the horses, and she felt the specific quality of a morning that had gone differently than it could have. "He'll hold," Rhett said, not a question, but checking. "He'll hold," she said. "He's been trying to find a way out for months. We just gave him the door." She paused. "He's not a brave man, but he's a tired one. They do the same thing sometimes." They rode to Caldwell in the afternoon and collected the box from Ada Birch, who was a small, businesslike woman who asked no questions and received the letter from Craddock with the efficiency of someone who handled other people's complicated affairs for a living and had learned not to be curious about them. The box was heavy, which was a good sign. Heavy meant thorough. Castle opened it in his office that evening and spent an hour going through the contents while Rhett and Elena sat across from him. He read with the increasing stillness of a man who is finding more than he expected And when he finally set the last document down and looked up at them, his expression had the quality of something carefully controlled. "This is sufficient," he said. "More than sufficient." He paused. "The promissory note fabrication system is documented internally. There are correspondence letters between Craddock and the Graves holding companies that describe the scheme explicitly. There are names." He looked at Elena, "Including the Voss transfer." She held very still. "Your father's debt, the Graves syndicate correspondence authorizing the transfer, the name of the party who approved the enforcement action." He paused. "It's all here." "Doyle Graves," she said. "Yes," Kessel said. The room was quiet for a moment. Rhett reached over and put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. It was brief. A moment, not a gesture meant to be noticed. And then he moved it back. But she had felt the weight of it, the specific and honest weight of another person's hand saying something that didn't need words. And she was grateful for it in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone who asked. Castle sent a rider to the territorial capital that same night with a sealed package for the federal land investigator whose card Craddock had kept in his desk. He also sent a copy to the Attorney General's office and one to Bess Whitmore at the Gazette, because he said, and Elena agreed, that official processes worked faster when they knew someone was watching. They stayed the night in Caldwell and rode back to Iron Hollow the following morning. The land looked the same as it always did coming up from the valley. The ridge above, the pastures opening out on either side, the barn, and the house solid and low against the sky. The wire on the north approach had been restrung. The trenches were still there. The field hands were working the east fence, which needed new posts in 2 sections. Doss was on the porch when they rode in. "News?" he said. "Significant news," Rhett said, dismounting. "Good significant or bad significant?" "The kind that takes a while to fully become something," Elena said, swinging down and handing her horse off to the hand who came out of the barn, but pointed in the right direction. Doss looked at her, then at Rhett, then back at her. He had known Rhett Mercer for 38 years and could read the particular quality of the man's face the way most people read plain text, and something he saw now made him nod slowly, the nod of a man who is updating his understanding of a situation. "I'll put coffee on," he said. 3 days later, Doyle Graves came to Iron Hollow. Not with 19 men this time, with 4, and with a white cloth tied to the saddle of the man riding beside him, a gesture that meant different things depending on who was reading it. Elena was at the ridge crest when she saw them come up the road from the south, 4 riders, the cloth visible even at distance, and she sat very still and watched them come. She came down and told Rhett. He stood in the doorway of the house and watched them approach the fence line at the south boundary. Doyle Graves stopped at the fence and waited. He was a large man on a large horse. She'd seen him before, briefly, on the black horse that she'd shot out from under him. And he was on a different horse now, but had the same quality, the quality of someone who took up space with intention. His face was broad and weathered, which she hadn't expected. She'd built him in her mind as a certain kind of man, the Eastern business kind, and he was something older than that, something more frontier than she'd given him credit for. "Mercer," he called, "I'd like to talk." "You can talk from there," Rhett called back. A pause. "I'd rather be civil about this." "You sent 19 men through my wire," Rhett said. "Civil is a stretch." Graves looked at the house for a moment. Then his eyes moved to Elena, who was standing to Rhett's left, and he held her gaze for a long moment, not threatening exactly, more assessing, the way he'd looked up at the ridge in the dawn light before the shooting started. "Miss Voss," he said, "I'd like to speak to you directly." She walked to the fence. Rhett came with her, which she had expected and had not asked him not to. Up close, Graves looked like a man who had spent the past 10 days revising his position on something and had not yet finished the revision. There were decisions happening behind his eyes, the kind of decisions that showed even on faces trained to show nothing. "The Attorney General's office contacted my lawyers yesterday," he said. She hadn't known it had moved that fast. She kept her face neutral. "They have documentation from a county official," he said, "and they have a federal investigator arriving in the territory next week." He paused. "I want to understand what kind of resolution you're looking for." Elena looked at him. She had spent 9 months building toward this moment, through a root cellar and a frozen train station, and borrowed boots, and a 130-yard rifle shot, and a list of names folded against her chest. She had imagined this moment many ways. She had imagined herself saying many things. What she said was, "Give back the land." Graves was quiet. "Every property acquired through the debt scheme," she said. "Every ranch taken through fabricated transfers. The land goes back to the people it was taken from, or to their families if they're gone." She paused. "The Voss land first." "That's—" He stopped, reconsidered. "That's not a negotiation. That's a demand." "Yes," she said. "The federal investigation will take years," he said. "My lawyers—" "Your lawyers are going to look at the internal correspondence that Craddock kept," she said, "and they are going to tell you that fighting this costs more than settling it, because the correspondence has your name on it, Mr. Graves, not a holding company, not a subsidiary, yours." She held his gaze. "So yes, this is a demand." The four men with him were very still. The white cloth moved slightly in the summer wind. Doyle Graves looked at her for a long time. She held the look without moving, without the small adjustments most people make under that kind of sustained attention, without shifting her weight, or dropping her eyes, or finding something else in the middle distance to look at. She had learned this stillness in the months since September, in the process of becoming something different from what the September fire had almost erased. "I'll need 30 days, he said, "to arrange the transfers." "You have 3 weeks, she said. "Castle's office will supervise." Another pause. Something moved across his face. Not surrender exactly, not in the way that word implied defeat. Something more like the recognition of a man who has met the boundary of what he can take and has decided that the cost of pushing against it is higher than he is willing to pay. It was not, she knew, a moral recognition. It was arithmetic. But arithmetic was enough. 3 weeks, he said. He turned his horse and rode back down the south road with his 4 men, and the white cloth moved against the summer air, and Elena watched him go until he was past the first turn and out of sight. Rhett was quiet for a moment beside her. Then he said, "You didn't mention the criminal charges." "No," she said. "The Attorney General's file is still open. Craddock's testimony is still on record." "I know." She watched the empty road. "The civil resolution doesn't close the criminal process. That runs on its own track." She paused. "He doesn't know that." Rhett looked at her. "He thinks if he gives the land back, the federal file goes quiet," she said. "It won't. But the land comes back first, and the families who lost it get that back, regardless of what happens to him afterward." She turned to look at Rhett. "I wanted the land first. The rest is for the law to finish." He looked at her for a long moment. "Your father would have liked you," he said. It was not a complicated statement. It was a simple one, which was why it hit the way it did. Direct, without cushion, like the truth usually was when someone who didn't use words carelessly finally used them. She looked back at the road. "He did like me," she said quietly. "I'm still figuring out how to be the person he thought I was." Rhett said nothing, which was exactly right. They stood at the south fence in the summer morning and let the silence be what it was, and the land spread out around them in all directions. The ridge and the pastures and the north approach with its restrung wire and its trenches that still needed filling, and somewhere 11 miles away, a man on a horse reconsidering the arithmetic of his own life, and somewhere in Caldwell, a box of documents that would take a long time to fully become what they were, and far away in a field east of Millhaven Creek, the land that had belonged to Cole Voss beginning, in whatever slow legal way these things began, to find its way back to his daughter. The coffee Doss had put on was still hot when they came back to the house, and Faye was making something for lunch that smelled of the summer herbs she kept on the kitchen windowsill. And Thomas Reyes was sitting on the porch with his bandaged arm in a sling, practicing a card trick that wasn't working yet. An Iron Hollow Ridge held all of it, the ordinary and the hard won and the aftermath of things, the way it had held everything else, without ceremony, just by continuing to stand. The 3 weeks Doyle Graves had been given passed with the specific tension of time that knows it is being measured. Castle's office became the center of a small, complicated machinery. Transfer documents arriving by courier, surveyed boundary confirmations, the slow reversal of 2 years of fabricated legal architecture. It was not clean work. Nothing about undoing fraud was clean, because fraud built on itself the way legitimate things built on themselves, each layer resting on the one below and dismantling it required going back to the foundation and pulling out every false stone individually. Castle had 2 assistants working full days on it. He sent updates to Iron Hollow every 3 days, and Elena read each one at the kitchen table with the same careful attention she'd given the survey documents in winter, looking for gaps, for things left unaddressed, for the places where a man with good lawyers might preserve something he shouldn't. She found 2. She sent them back to Castle with notes in the margins. He wrote back, "You should have been a lawyer, HC." She wrote back, "I had other plans. Make them fix it. EV." They fixed it. The Voss land transfer was the first one completed on a Thursday morning in the 17th day, and Castle sent a writer to Iron Hollow with the signed documentation before the ink was properly dry. Elena was in the barn when the writer came, and Rhett took the documents inside and waited for her. And when she came in from the barn with hay in her hair and her coat half-buttoned, he was sitting at the table with the papers in front of him and his hands flat on either side of them. She looked at his face first, then at the papers. She sat down and read through them. It took her several minutes because she read them the way she read everything now, carefully, looking for the gap, the false stone, the thing that looked right but wasn't. There was nothing. The documentation was clean. The Voss Ranch east of Millhaven Creek, the land her grandfather had first broken, and her father had worked for 30 years, and that had burned on a September night while she lay in a root cellar listening to men with no claim on it walk over her head. It was hers. She put the papers down. She did not cry, which surprised her. She had imagined this moment in the way you imagine things that feel so far away they live in the category of imagination rather than expectation, and she had imagined something more dramatic than this. More tears, or more anger releasing, or some large internal event that corresponded to the size of what had happened. What she felt instead was a quieter thing, harder to name, like a door that had been held shut by pressure finally swinging free. Not dramatic, just the absence of a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing its shape. "It's done," she said. "First part," Rhett said. "Yes." She looked at the papers again. "First part." The first part was the land. The second part was what Castle had called the criminal process running on its own track. And it ran, slowly and with the particular grinding momentum of official consequence, through the autumn and into the following year. The federal land investigator, a woman named Judith Crane, small and precise and with a memory for documents that Elena found impressive and slightly unnerving, arrived in the territory in late August and spent 6 weeks conducting interviews that left a series of very uncomfortable men in Harrow's Fork and the county seat reassessing their recent life choices. Craddock testified. He did it in the careful, procedural way of a man who had negotiated his terms before speaking, but he was thorough, and what he had to say about the internal operations of the Graves Syndicate filled a great many pages of official record. His cooperation was acknowledged, as Rhett had promised. He was not exonerated. There was no version of the story in which that was honest. But the consequences he faced were substantially reduced by the fact of what he gave up. And Elena, when she heard the outcome months later, found that she could live with the arithmetic of it. It was not perfect justice. It was the justice that had been available. Doyle Graves was a different matter. He had believed, Elena was fairly certain, that returning the land would close the federal file. He had made a businessman's error. The error of assuming that because something was a transaction to him, it was a transaction to everyone. The Attorney General's office had not treated it as a transaction. Judith Crane had not treated it as a transaction. The internal correspondence with Graves's name on it, specifying the enforcement action against the Voss Ranch, specifying the names of the men sent and the instructions they were given, was not the kind of document that a land transfer made go away. He was arrested in October in the eastern city where he'd retreated after the failed siege of Iron Hollow by federal marshals who had jurisdiction that the county marshals he'd purchased did not. His lawyers were good, and the process was long, and its full resolution stretched past the point where this story's present tense has any business lingering. But the outcome was never seriously in doubt after Craddock's testimony and Crane's report, and in the way that matters most, the daily, practical way. The Graves Syndicate stopped operating the moment its operational leadership was in federal custody. The empire had no architecture without the man who ran it. It collapsed the way overbuilt things collapse, all at once, then completely. The other families got their land back. Not all of them. Some properties had been sold and resold through enough hands that the legal path back was too complicated or too costly to navigate, and those were the losses that lived in the ledger of things that cannot be fully made right, only acknowledged. But most of them. Clara Moreau's land had never been formally taken. The syndicate's approach there had stalled with the Iron Hollow resistance, and she returned to her ranch without the need for legal intervention, which she received with the dignified satisfaction of a woman who had expected no less. The Cullen brothers went home to their property and their cattle and their economy of expression, and Frank sent a brief note to Iron Hollow that said, "Good result, F. Cullen." 3 words that contained, from Frank, considerable warmth. Elena rode to the Voss Ranch in September, 3 weeks after the transfer completed. She went alone, which was a decision she made without being entirely conscious of making it. She just found herself saddling her horse in the early morning before anyone else was up, and riding east in the direction she'd avoided looking for 9 months. And it was only when she was an hour out from Iron Hollow that she understood she hadn't told anyone where she was going. The land came up familiar in the way that things come up familiar when you have been away from them long enough for the familiarity to be shot through with strangeness. The hills she recognized, the creek crossing at the lower property line, the willows along the bank that had always gone yellow-green in late summer, the fence lines that her father had built and rebuilt over 30 years, which were in poor repair now, some sections down, others leaning, the wire slack, but still there, still defining the shape of the thing. The house was gone. She'd known it would be. The syndicate had cleared the burned structure at some point, probably to make the property more transactable, and what remained was the stone foundation and the stone chimney standing in the tall grass that had grown up through the floor plan of the place she'd grown up in. The root cellar access was still there, a wooden hatch in the ground near where the kitchen had been, weathered now, the iron handle rusted. She did not open it. She stood in the foundation of the house for a long time, in the tall grass, in the September light. A hawk was working the thermals above the east pasture. The willows down at the creek moved in a light wind that she could hear but not quite feel from where she was standing. The land was the same land, the hills, the sky, the particular quality of light in this specific valley that she had known since she was small enough that the fence posts were tall to her. The land was the same. The house was not. She had thought she would feel something large here. Instead, she felt something true, which was not always the same thing. What she felt was that her father had loved this place with the love that comes from having made something rather than being given it, and that this love had transferred to her in the way that the deepest things transfer between parents and children, not through instruction, but through proximity, through years of watching someone treat a piece of ground as though it mattered, as though what you built was worth building carefully. She felt that she had not been able to save him, and that she had to keep not being able to save him for the rest of her life, and that this was the true nature of loss. Not the event, but the permanence of the event, the way it stayed exactly what it was, no matter what you built around it. She also felt, standing in the foundation of her father's house, that she was not the person who had hidden in the root cellar. She had not become someone who didn't hide out of courage, exactly. She had become someone who had learned, through the long specific work of months and people and ground, that the only thing worse than the fight is the root cellar, that the darkness you choose is still darkness, and that choosing it doesn't protect you from grief. It just separates you from the people who might help you carry it. That was what Iron Hollow had given her, she thought. Not safety, not a home, not yet, not in a simple way. What it had given her was a picture of what it looked like when people stayed. She rode back in the afternoon and reached the ridge as the sun was going down, and Rhett was on the porch when she came in, and he looked at her face and understood, in the way he had come to understand things about her without requiring explanation, where she had been. "All right?" he said. "Yes," she said. And then, "I don't think I can go back there, to live there." He nodded, not surprised. "The land is mine," she said. "I'll keep it. I'll get it running again eventually, lease it to someone who'll work it well." She paused. "But it's not home anymore." She looked at the house behind him, the stone and timber, the porch with its 3 sides, the windows with their warm light. "I didn't know that until I went back." Rhett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Iron Hollow could use a second opinion on most of its major decisions." She looked at him. Doss is reliable, he said, but he agrees with me about 70% of the time, which isn't enough disagreement for good outcomes. That's not a particularly romantic argument, she said. No, he agreed. He looked at her steadily. I'm not a particularly romantic man. You've had enough time to know that. She had. She also knew that he had sat with her through a winter of her worst grief and hadn't tried to fix it or move it along. That he had handed her a rifle and taught her to use it and not made it mean anything except that she needed to know how. That he had ridden to Harrow's Fork beside her when he could have sent anyone. That he had put his hand over hers for one moment in a lawyer's office in Caldwell and not made a performance of it. And that he had stood at a south fence in the summer morning and told her that her father would have liked her and meant it like a fact rather than a comfort. All right, she said. All right, he said. They went inside for dinner, and Doss looked at them both when they came in, and then looked carefully at the ceiling, and Faye put an extra biscuit on Elena's plate without comment. And the kitchen was loud with the ordinary noise of people who had been through something together and had come out the other side still intact, which was not a small thing, and nobody made a speech about it. The seasons turned. What Elena had told Rhett, that she would lease the Voss land to someone who would work it, she did, after considerable time spent finding the right person, which turned out to be a young couple from the South who had been looking for ground and who, when Elena rode out to show them the property, asked careful questions about soil quality and water rights and fence maintenance, and said nothing about the burned house or the foundation in the grass or the rusted hatch of the root cellar. She appreciated this. She leased it to them at a fair rate and visited twice a year and watched the land become something new without being required to pretend that the something new erased the something that had been. Mara Quinn arrived at Iron Hollow on a Tuesday in the second spring, which was how significant things tended to arrive, not on days that announced themselves, but on ordinary days that became significant only in retrospect. She was 17 and had the look of someone who had been making decisions entirely alone for long enough that asking for help had become something she'd forgotten was possible. She came up the road on foot with a saddlebag over one shoulder and a hat that had been better days, and she asked at the gate if there was work. Elena was the one who came out to the gate. She looked at this girl, thin in the specific way that came from not having enough to eat, eyes steady in the way that came from having learned to look like you weren't afraid when you were, and she felt something shift in her chest that she would not have been able to describe precisely, but that had something to do with a train station and a bench and a particular quality of snow. What kind of work? Elena asked. Anything you have, Mara said. Elena looked at her for a moment longer. Then she said, Come inside. Have you eaten today? Mara hesitated, the hesitation of someone deciding whether to admit something. No, she said. Then come inside, Elena said, and left the gate open. Rhett received this development with the equanimity of a man who had stopped being surprised by the things Elena Voss brought home, which now included a 17-year-old with a saddlebag and no clear past who ate 3 helpings at dinner, and thanked Faye with the grave sincerity of someone for whom a meal was not a small thing. He asked Mara enough questions to understand that she had no family to go back to and no plan beyond the next immediate need, and then he looked at Elena across the table, and she looked back at him, and something was decided without words in the way decisions had been made in this house for years now. Mara stayed. She was not easy, which was what made her real. She was stubborn in the way that people who have survived alone develop stubborn, as armor first and habit second, and it took months before she stopped treating every act of generosity as something that would eventually be taken back. She had a temper that came from somewhere she hadn't talked about yet and might not for a long time. She was also, underneath all of it, someone with a deep and serious attention to the world. She watched things carefully. She learned fast. She asked questions that were better than most of the answers she received, and she had a dry humor that emerged slowly, in small installments, like something returning to life after a long frost. Elena taught her to ride properly, not just to sit a horse. She could already do that, but to really ride, the way Doss had corrected Elena and Frank Cullen had corrected Elena, and the long process of being taught and corrected had added up to something that Elena could now pass on. She taught her to read a fence line and a survey map. She did not teach her to shoot because Mara didn't need it yet, and you didn't give people tools for problems that weren't in front of them. What Elena gave Mara that wasn't a skill was harder to name. It was the thing she had received from Rhett in winter, the things she hadn't had words for then and only partly had words for now, the specific experience of being in a place where the people around you are not going anywhere, where the ground under your feet is solid, not because nothing bad will happen, but because the people on it have decided to stay on it regardless of what comes. It was not comfort, exactly. It was more load-bearing than comfort. It was the structure that made everything else possible. Mara, for her part, gave Iron Hollow something back. Young people do this. They bring the future into a place, not dramatically, but in the small daily ways of someone who still has most of their time ahead of them, who asks questions about things the older people have stopped questioning because they've been living with the answers for years. She made Doss laugh more than he had in years. She drove Faye to mild distraction and deep affection simultaneously. She argued with Rhett about cattle management with the confident wrongness of someone who would eventually be right. And she took the losses of those arguments as learning rather than defeat, which was the rarest and most useful quality. The years did what years do. Doss's knees went bad and then his back, and then he retired to the small house behind the barn where Faye and her husband lived, and he spent his days doing the things he'd had no time for when the ranch consumed everything. Carving small figures from wood that he gave away to no one in particular, teaching Mara to play cards, sitting on the porch in the afternoons, watching the ridge in the comfortable way of someone who has earned the right to simply look at things. Rhett aged in the way that strong men age. Slowly, then suddenly, the body following a schedule the mind hasn't agreed to. He never fully recovered the easy movement in his right shoulder after a fall from a horse at 62, and he managed the ranch from closer quarters after that, which annoyed him less than Elena expected and which, she understood eventually, was not resignation but something else. A gradual willingness to let the place he'd built run itself, to trust that what he'd made was solid enough to carry on without his hands on every part of it. They had a life between them that was not simple and was not without its friction. They disagreed about money and about the timing of decisions and about when to let Mara make her own mistakes and when to say something. They had seasons of distance, the way long partnerships have seasons. Not coldness exactly, just the periods when two people who spend all their time together need more of it in their own heads. And learning to give that without making it mean something it didn't was its own ongoing work. They were not a perfect match in the fairy tale sense. They were a good match in the honest sense, which was that they were better together than separately at the things that mattered, and that they had chosen each other not once but continuously in the daily decisions of a shared life, and that this kind of choosing had a depth to it that the initial kind didn't. Rhett died on a November morning in his 69th year in the house he had been born in and had built and lost and rebuilt and defended, in the bed that looked out the east window at the ridge he had walked every day of his life. It was not a dramatic death. He was sick for 2 weeks with something that the doctor from Caldwell came and looked at twice and couldn't fully name, and then he was less sick for a few days, and then he was very tired, and then he was gone. Elena was with him. Mara was in the next room. Doss knew before anyone came to tell him, in the way that people who have loved someone for a very long time seem to know. Elena sat with him for a while after, in the way she'd learned to sit with things, without performing what she felt, without rushing herself past it. She was 51 years old. She had buried her father at 23, and she had thought at the time that there was a scale of loss, that losing him was the largest thing that could happen to a person, and that the size of it defined some kind of limit. What she knew now was that loss did not work on a scale. Each one was its own shape, its own specific weight, and what you got better at was not feeling less but carrying it differently. Not further from your body, not buried, but integrated, held the way you held a scar, present and real, and part of you without being the only thing about you. She missed him. She would miss him for the rest of her life with the specific texture of missing someone who occupied a space that no one else's shape would fit into. She did not pretend otherwise, and she did not fall apart, and neither of these things canceled the other out. Mara took over more of the ranch's management after that, which was the practical consequence of the thing. And she was ready for it in the way that people are ready for things they've been preparing for without knowing they were preparing. She had Doss's approval, which was the approval that mattered on Iron Hollow, and she had Elena's, which she had been working toward for 4 years in the gradual, serious way she worked toward everything. Elena did not retire exactly. She was not built for retirement and never would be. What she did was change the proportion of things. Less of the daily work that required strength she was conserving, More of the thinking and the deciding and the long conversations at the kitchen table about what the ranch was and where it was going. She planted a garden that Rhett had always meant to plant and never had, along the south wall of the house where the sun reached in the afternoons. And she was terrible at it for the first 2 years and better at it after that, and this felt accurate to her. That even at her age, she could still be a beginner at something, still be working toward rather than arriving at. A territorial official came to Iron Hollow in the spring of Elena's 56th year to inform her that a formal declaration had been issued. The bounties that the Graves Syndicate had fabricated against her were officially cleared from the territorial record, and her name was formally recognized as having been subject to fraudulent process. It was a bureaucratic event, dry and procedural, a piece of paper that arrived more than a decade after the events it addressed. The official seemed to expect her to be moved by it in some visible way. She thanked him and poured him coffee and sent him on his way. What moved her was not the paper. What moved her was a conversation she had with Mara that evening, sitting on the porch in the spring dark, when Mara asked her, directly, in the blunt and honest way Mara asked everything, what it had actually been like that winter. The station, the frozen bench, the borrowed boots, the root cellar before all of it. Elena thought about how to answer that honestly. I was completely out of options, she said. I had nothing. I had less than nothing. I had a name and a story that made people uncomfortable, and the anger was the only thing that still felt like mine. She looked at the ridge, dark against the darker sky. I kept the anger like it was a lantern. It was the only light I had. She paused. What I didn't understand then was that you can't navigate by it. You can see by it, but you can't navigate. Mara was quiet for a moment. She was 24 now, and sitting beside her, Elena could see the person she'd been becoming for 7 years. The stubborn and complicated and unexpectedly tender person the saddlebag girl had grown into. What do you navigate by? Mara asked. People, Elena said. The ones who stay. She looked at Mara. And what you're willing to build. Mara nodded slowly, the way she nodded when something registered at a level below argument. The seasons continued because they did not stop for anything. Elena gave Mara the full title to Iron Hollow on a morning in her 63rd year with Castle's successor, a young lawyer from Caldwell who had heard the story and conducted himself with the self-conscious historical awareness of someone handling something he understood to be significant, managing the paperwork. She did not leave. She was not going anywhere, and the title transfer was not a departure but a passing of weight, a deliberate and chosen redistribution of what the land carried so that it could be carried forward without her having to carry all of it. She kept the second bedroom. She kept the garden. She kept the long evenings on the porch watching the ridge go dark, and the mornings when the light came over the ridge crest and hit the east pasture in the way it had hit it every morning for 30 years and showed no sign of stopping. She kept the list too. Not in her coat pocket anymore. She'd moved it years ago to the small box she kept on the table beside her bed, the box that held the particular artifacts of a life. Her father's watch, a letter from Clara Moreau written the year after the siege, a pressed wildflower that Mara had put in her hand wordlessly on a summer ride years back and that Elena had kept without knowing why. The list was folded among these things, the paper soft now from years of handling. She had unfolded it sometimes, over the years, and looked at the 4 names. The arithmetic of what had happened to each of them was complicated and imperfect and not satisfying in the way that stories in retrospect sometimes made violence satisfying. Burl Cantor had died before any legal consequence reached him, which was the kind of outcome that life delivered without apology. 2 of the others had served time and been released and gone wherever men go when the official consequence is finished, and the rest of it is their own. Doyle Graves had spent 6 years in federal confinement before ill health caused a conditional release, and he had died 2 years after that in an eastern city, in a building whose address she did not know. She did not know what she felt about any of that. She had stopped expecting to know. The feelings were present, but they did not resolve into something clean, and she had come to believe that this was the honest condition, that the worst things that happen to a person do not produce clean resolutions in the chest, only the ongoing fact of having survived them and built something anyway. What she knew, sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching Mara come in from the pasture on the horse, she rode better every year, watching the kitchen light come on, and knowing that someone was making dinner in the house that had been built by a man she loved and defended by people who had chosen to stay. What she knew was that this was what survival was actually for. Not the continuing to exist, not even the winning of the fight, though the fight had been real and necessary and she would not diminish it. What it was for was this: the ordinary evening, the lit window, the land that had been defended not because it was land, but because of what land means when it becomes the ground you live your choices on. She was 71 years old when she died. It was a morning in early spring, and the garden along the south wall was just beginning to show the first pale green of the season, and the ridge was clear against a blue sky. And she was in the chair on the porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold beside her when Mara found her. She did not look as though something had ended. She looked like someone who had put down something heavy and rested. People came from the valley, from Caldwell, from the county seat, from places she had not been in years. Claire Moreau's granddaughter came. An old man who turned out to be Tomas Reyes, who had lived and worked and raised children in the territory, came and stood at the grave behind the house with his hat in his hands and a face that had 60 years of weather on it. Bess Whitmore's paper, which had changed hands twice but was still running, printed a piece that said very little in a lot of words, which was the newspaper's way, and then said one true thing: that Elena Voss had made a decision in a root cellar in September of 1887 to not stay where it was dark, and that this decision had consequences that outlived her. Mara buried her beside Rhett, which was where she belonged and where she would have wanted to be, though she had never said so because some things did not need to be said to be understood. Iron Hollow continued. The cattle moved through the seasons. The fences needed work every spring. The ridge held its shape against whatever weather came at it. Mara ran the ranch with the same combination of stubbornness and attention she'd brought to everything since she arrived with a saddlebag and no clear plan. And she made her own mistakes and learned her own versions of the things Elena had learned, which was as it should be. Not a repetition, but a continuation. Each person finding their own way to the same true things. The land remembered the way land does. Not in words, not in stone markers or official records, though those existed too, but in the simpler and more durable way of having been cared for. The fences Cole Voss built were long gone, rebuilt and rebuilt again, but the pasture lines were the same lines. The creek crossing at the lower Voss property ran the same water. The ridge at Iron Hollow caught the same light every morning over the east pasture, and whoever was watching it, Mara, or her people, or the people after them, was standing on ground that had been fought for not out of pride or possession, but out of the belief that what you built with your hands and your choices and your willingness to stay deserved to last. It was not a perfect story. It was a true one, which is different and sometimes harder to tell. But it is worth telling for the same reason any of them are worth telling. Because somewhere, on some ordinary Tuesday, there is a person at the bottom of a very dark place holding the only light they have, which is anger or grief or the bare stubborn fact of still being there. And what they need is not a miracle. What they need is the knowledge that other people have stood in that same dark and found their way to something worth standing in the light for. Elena Voss found it. Iron Hollow endured. That is enough.